Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Greece and their fascinating approach to love that would make modern dating apps absolutely implode. Here's something that'll knock your sandals off. The civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, and the Olympics also had a completely different playbook when it came to romantic relationships. One that would send your grandmother clutching her pearls and reaching for her smelling salts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into a world where love had rules that make modern relationship status updates look simple. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Greek love. Most people imagine ancient Greece as some kind of free love paradise where everyone was skipping around in togas, having philosophical discussions about feelings. In reality, Greek attitudes toward love were more complicated than a modern polyamorous relationship agreement written by lawyers. This wasn't some ancient version of Woodstock. It was a highly structured society, with more rules about who could love whom than a medieval arranged marriage contract. Think of it like this. If modern dating is like playing chess, ancient Greek love was like playing 4D chess while blindfolded on a unicycle during an earthquake. Every relationship had social hierarchies, age considerations, civic duties, and enough unwritten rules to make Emily Post weep into her etiquette manual. And if you thought navigating modern dating was complicated, just wait until you hear about trying to court someone in ancient Athens. The 5th century BCE was Athens' golden age, when democracy was as fresh as morning bread and philosophy was the hottest new trend since sliced ... Well, bread wasn't sliced yet, but you get the idea. Ancient Greece wasn't the romantic comedy version you might imagine. It was more like a political drama, with occasional musical numbers and a lot more nudity in the gym. The city-states controlled everything from your voting rights to your workout routine, and the consequences of stepping out of line were about as pleasant as a Spartan boot camp led by angry wasps. If you thought ancient Greeks were all sitting around in white robes discussing the meaning of life while eating grapes, think again. They were dealing with wars, politics, trade disputes, and social hierarchies more complex than a modern corporate org chart. Athens alone had citizens, medics, foreign residents, and slaves, each with different rights and social expectations. The gymnasium wasn't just where buff guys worked out. It was the social center where politics, philosophy, and romance all mixed together like ingredients in a very complicated soup dot. And here's where it gets interesting. Their approach to love and relationships was so intertwined with their concepts of education, citizenship, and social status that you couldn't separate romance from politics any more than you could separate a philosopher from his beard. The relationships that modern people might raise eyebrows at weren't just tolerated. They were often seen as essential parts of education and social development. It's like if LinkedIn, Tinder, and Harvard all merged into one institution, except with more olive oil and fewer clothes. Enter Socrates, the man who made asking annoying questions into an art form and probably drove more people crazy than a GPS with a broken voice chip. This guy was married to Xanthippe, a woman so famously difficult that her name became synonymous with nagging wives everywhere. But here's the twist that would make modern relationship counselors reach for their strongest: coffee. Socrates spent most of his time hanging around the gymnasium, engaging in what we politely call mentoring relationships with young men. But wait, it gets better. Socrates claimed he was guided by his daemonion, essentially his inner voice that told him what not to do. Imagine having a personal life coach that only spoke up to say, "Don't do that, you idiot," and you've got the general idea. This same Socrates, who could out-argue anyone in Athens and drink them under the table while doing it. Spent his evenings at symposiums, which weren't boring academic conferences, but drinking parties where grown men lay around on couches, discussed philosophy, and engaged in activities that would make your modern HR department faint. The specific example that really captures this complexity: Socrates famously resisted the advances of Alcibiades, one of the most beautiful and wealthy young men in Athens. Alcibiades literally threw himself at Socrates, and I mean literally. He climbed into bed with him, and Socrates just talked philosophy until the poor guy gave up. It's like being hit on by a Greek god and responding with a TED talk about virtue. The consequences of this weren't a social scandal, but increased respect for Socrates' self-control. And if you think that's confusing, wait until you hear about how this all connected to their educational system. This wasn't just about ancient people having different relationship preferences. We're talking about a fundamental difference in how an entire civilization understood love, education, power, and social development. These relationships shaped military alliances, political careers, and philosophical schools. They determined who got mentored in the skills that mattered for citizenship, who had access to the networks that controlled trade and politics, and who would carry on the intellectual traditions that still influence us today. The people affected weren't just the individuals involved. Entire families' social status could rise or fall based on these connections. A young man's future prospects, his political career, his business opportunities, even his reputation as a philosopher or artist, could all depend on these mentoring relationships that combined emotional, intellectual, and yes, physical elements. This mattered then because it was how their society actually functioned, not as some side issue or alternative lifestyle, but as a core part of how knowledge was transmitted, how social bonds were formed, and how power was exercised. And it matters now because it challenges every assumption we had about traditional relationships and forces us to confront the fact that our modern categories might not be as universal as we think. But Socrates and his philosophical approach to love was just the beginning of a system so complex it makes modern relationship status options look like kindergarten categories. The gymnasium culture that shaped entire generations was about to reveal layers of meaning that would challenge everything we think we know about ancient civilization. The gymnasium culture of ancient Greece wasn't just about getting swole. It was a sophisticated social institution that combined education, politics, romance, and enough naked wrestling to make modern fitness influencers blush. Unlike our modern assumption that gyms are just places where people grunt at heavy objects while staring at themselves in mirrors, Greek gymnasiums were the beating heart of civilized society, where future leaders learned everything from rhetoric to mathematics, often while wearing nothing but olive oil and confidence. This wasn't some primitive version of a community center with a few dumbbells thrown in the corner. These were elaborate complexes with running tracks, wrestling areas, lecture halls, libraries, and gardens where the most important minds of the age would gather to shape the next generation. The gymnasium was where Plato founded his academy, where Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and where countless relationships formed that would influence Western civilization for millennia. But here's where modern sensibilities get their togas. In a twist, these weren't just places of intellectual development. The gymnasium was where older men, we're talking established citizens, successful merchants, respected philosophers, would seek out younger men for relationships that combine mentorship, friendship, and romantic attachment. Think of it as LinkedIn meets eHarmony meets Harvard, except everyone's naked and the networking happens between wrestling matches. The historical context for this system is crucial to understand. In a society where formal education as we know it didn't exist, where there were no universities, no standardized curricula, and no guidance counselors, The gymnasium served as the primary mechanism for transmitting knowledge, skills, and cultural values from one generation to the next. It was democracy's training ground, philosophy's nursery, and romance's playground, all rolled into one institution that somehow managed to function without a single PowerPoint presentation or team building exercise. Take the relationship between Harmodius and Aristogiton, two lovers who became the poster boys for both romantic devotion and political assassination, a combination that would make modern campaign managers break out in hives. Harmodius was a young, beautiful Athenian citizen, the kind of guy who probably had admirers following him around like lovesick puppies. Aristogiton was his older lover, a respected member of society who'd taken Harmodius under his wing in the traditional mentor-student relationship that was considered not just normal, but admirable. Here's where the story gets spicy. Hipparchus, the brother of the tyrant Hippias, decided he wanted a piece of the Harmodius action. When Harmodius rejected his advances because he was already in a committed relationship, thank you very much, Hipparchus did what any mature adult would do. He publicly humiliated Harmodius by refusing to let his sister participate in a religious festival, essentially calling her unworthy of the honor. In ancient Greek terms, this was like posting embarrassing photos of someone's family on social media, except the consequences were potentially fatal rather than just socially awkward. Aristogiton's response was immediate and decisive. He and Harmodius decided to assassinate both Hipparchus and Hippias during the Panathenaic festival. The plan went about as well as most assassination plots hatched by lovers, which is to say, spectacularly badly. They managed to kill Hipparchus, but missed Hippias entirely, leading to Harmodius being killed on the spot and Aristogiton being captured, tortured, and executed. But here's the kicker. Instead of being remembered as failed terrorists, they became celebrated as the tyrannicides, heroes who died for love and democracy. The Athenians were so impressed by this romantic political sacrifice that they erected statues of the pair, commissioned songs about their heroism, and gave their descendants free meals for life. It's like if Bonnie and Clyde had been honored with a national holiday in a musical instead of being gunned down by police. The message was clear. A love strong enough to inspire political action was worthy of eternal commemoration. Another example that perfectly captures the complexity of these relationships involves Alcibiades again, the same guy who tried to seduce Socrates and got a philosophy lecture instead. Alcibiades was basically the golden boy of Athens, wealthy, beautiful, politically connected, and about as morally flexible as a yoga instructor. He had multiple mentors throughout his life, each relationship following the traditional pattern of an older man guiding a younger one in exchange for companionship and, presumably, other benefits. But Alcibiades wasn't content to be anyone's passive student. He manipulated these relationships like a master chess player, using his charm and beauty to gain political advantage, military support, and social status. When he was accused of defacing religious statues and mocking sacred mysteries, basically the ancient equivalent of posting blasphemous memes, he fled Athens and offered his services to Sparta, their greatest enemy. Later, when the Spartans got tired of him, he switched sides again, this time to the Persians. Throughout all these political machinations, Alcibiades maintained his network of relationships, using the bonds formed in the gymnasium to navigate the treacherous waters of ancient politics. His mentors and former lovers became his political allies, his sources of information, and occasionally his bitter enemies. It was a system where personal relationships and political power were so intertwined that you couldn't tell where romance ended and statecraft began. One mentor allegedly helped Alcibiades escape Athens under cover of darkness, providing ships and supplies for his flight to Sparta. Another former lover later testified against him in court, claiming their relationship had been a cover for political espionage. The whole situation was messier than a reality TV show, except the stakes were the fate of the Athenian Empire, rather, and who gets voted off the island. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in ancient Greece ever was. The gymnasium culture that celebrated these mentor-student relationships also had strict rules about who could participate, when, and how. It was like a country club with benefits, except the membership requirements were more complex than modern. Tax law and the social expectations could literally be a matter of life and death. First, there was the age factor. These relationships were supposed to follow a specific timeline. The older partner, called the erased lover, would pursue. A younger partner, the eromenos, beloved, who was expected to be in his teens or early 20s. But the younger partner wasn't supposed to be too enthusiastic about the physical aspects of the relationship. Showing too much pleasure or initiative could damage his reputation faster than a bad Yelp review. He was supposed to be motivated by admiration for his mentor's wisdom and virtue, not by, shall we say, baser instincts. Then there were class considerations that made modern social stratification look simple. Only free citizens could participate fully in gymnasium culture. Slaves were excluded entirely, and foreign residents, medics, had limited access. Even among citizens, there were subtle hierarchies based on wealth, family connections, and political influence. It wasn't enough to be attracted to someone. You had to navigate a social minefield where one wrong move could destroy your reputation, your family's standing, and your political prospects. The contradictory evidence gets even more interesting when you look at how these relationships were supposed to end. Ideally, as the younger partner matured, he would transition from beloved to lover, seeking out his own younger partner to mentor. But what happened when partners were reluctant to move on? What about relationships that lasted well beyond the socially acceptable time frame? Ancient sources hint at controversies and scandals involving men who refused to follow the traditional script. But the details are often frustratingly vague. Different city-states had different attitudes toward these relationships, adding another layer of complexity. What was celebrated in Athens might be frowned upon in Sparta, where military considerations took precedence over philosophical mentorship. The Spartan approach to male relationships was more focused on building military bonds and warrior loyalty than on intellectual development or romantic fulfillment. Modern analogies break down when you try to compare a system where love, education, and military service were all part of the same cultural package. The result was a society where personal relationships had political consequences that ripple through history books like dominoes falling in slow motion. These gymnasium-forged bonds shaped military alliances, philosophical schools, and political movements in ways that would make modern lobbyists weep with envy. When Harmodius and Aristogeiton became martyrs for love and democracy, they didn't just inspire romantic poetry. They helped establish the ideological foundation for Athenian democracy that would influence political thought for centuries. The institutional reactions to these relationships reveal just how central they were to Greek society. Rather than being marginalized or hidden, they were celebrated in art, literature, and public ceremonies. Pottery depicting these relationships was common household decoration. Poets wrote elaborate verses about famous couples, and philosophers used them as examples of the highest forms of human connection. It's like if relationship status updates became the basis for constitutional law and dating apps were considered essential civic infrastructure. The long-term implications extended far beyond ancient Greece. The philosophical schools that emerged from these relationships, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Stoic schools, became the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. The mentorship model that combined emotional attachment with intellectual development influenced educational systems for centuries. Even today, when we talk about graduate advisors, doctoral mentors, and academic relationships were using concepts that trace back to these ancient gymnasium partnerships. But there were also unintended consequences that ancient Greeks probably didn't see coming. The emphasis on male relationships in public spaces meant that women were largely excluded from the intellectual and political networks that shaped society. This created a parallel world where women had their own social structures and relationships, but these remained largely invisible to the male-dominated world of politics and philosophy. It's like having two separate social media platforms where one gets all the attention and the other operates in the shadows. The reactions from later civilizations were mixed, to put it mildly. Early Christians condemned the entire system as morally corrupt. Romans adopted modified versions that emphasized different aspects. And modern scholars have spent centuries trying to understand how something so central to Greek culture could be so foreign to later Western values. The cognitive dissonance of celebrating ancient Greek democracy while condemning ancient Greek love has created more academic controversies than you could shake a symposium at. Meanwhile, while the gymnasium culture was shaping the minds and hearts of Athens' future leaders, another aspect of Greek society was developing that would prove equally influential but far more controversial. The symposium culture, where politics, philosophy, and romance mixed like wine and water in a cup that no one was entirely sure how to drink from. These weren't just dinner parties. They were sophisticated social institutions where the rules of engagement were even more complex than gymnasium relationships, and where the consequences of getting things wrong could range from social embarrassment to political exile. If the gymnasium was where relationships began, the symposium was where they were tested, celebrated, and sometimes spectacularly destroyed in front of an audience of the most influential people in the city. The connections between gymnasium mentorship and symposium culture created a web of relationships so intricate that understanding ancient Greek society requires mapping not just political alliances and family connections, but romantic attachments, intellectual partnerships, and social obligations that crossed every boundary of what we might consider normal social interaction. The symposium culture was about to reveal just how deep this rabbit hole of ancient Greek relationship complexity could go. If gymnasium culture was the university campus of ancient Greece, then symposium culture was the faculty lounge, the student union, and the dean's office, all rolled into one alcohol-fueled social experiment that somehow managed to shape Western civilization between rounds of drinking games. Unlike the physical training and philosophical discussions of the gymnasium, symposiums were evening affairs where grown men would recline on couches like Roman emperors, drink wine mixed with water in ratios that would make modern bartenders weep, and engage in intellectual discourse that could range from profound philosophical insights to arguments about whose boyfriend was prettier. This wasn't just ancient Greeks having a good time after work. This was a sophisticated cultural institution, with more rules than a medieval court and more social nuance than a Jane Austen novel. The symposium was where political alliances were forged, where philosophical schools debated their ideas, and where romantic relationships played out in front of audiences who treated love affairs like interactive entertainment. Think of it as a combination of an academic conference, a political fundraiser, and a reality TV show, except everyone was drunk, and the consequences could include exile, assassination, or philosophical immortality. The context for why symposiums became so important lies in the structure of Greek society itself. In a world without mass media, social networks, or even reliable mail service, these gatherings were how information traveled, how opinions were formed, and how cultural values were transmitted. They were the Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn of the ancient world, except instead of 280-character hot takes, you got hours-long philosophical dialogues, punctuated by flute music and the occasional romantic drama. But here's where it gets interesting. From our perspective, these weren't stag parties or boys' nights out. The symposium was a highly ritualized event with specific protocols for everything from how to recline on your couch to how to properly dilute your wine. There were rules about who could speak when, what topics were appropriate for discussion, and how romantic advances should be conducted. It was like having a dinner party where every aspect was choreographed by a combination of mismanners. Plato and whoever invented speed dating, all while everyone was getting progressively more intoxicated on wine that tasted like it had been filtered through a goat. Consider the most famous symposium in history, Plato's Symposium, which wasn't just a philosophical dialogue, but a detailed account of an actual drinking party that took place in 416 BCE at the house of Agathon, a tragic poet who had just won first prize at a dramatic competition. The guest list reads like a who's who of Athenian intellectual society. Socrates, Aristophanes, the comedy writer, Eryximachus, a physician, Pausanias, a legal expert, and of course, Alcibiades, who showed up fashionably late and completely drunk, wearing a crown of ivy and violets like some ancient Greek party boy. The evening started innocently enough. They decided to go easy on the wine because most of them were still hungover from the previous night's celebration. Instead of the usual drinking games, they agreed to give speeches about the nature of love. What followed was a philosophical exploration that has influenced Western thought about love and relationships for over 2,000 years. Delivered by men reclining on couches, while occasionally pausing to flirt with the cute slave boys serving the wine. Each speaker offered a different perspective on love. Pausanias distinguished between common love, purely physical, and heavenly. Love, spiritual, and educational. Eryximachus argued that love was a cosmic force that governed everything from music to medicine. And Aristophanes delivered his famous myth about humans originally being round creatures with 4 arms and 4 legs who were split in half by Zeus, doomed to spend their lives searching for their other half. It's like an ancient Greek TED Talk series, except with more nudity and better catering. But the real drama came when Alcibiades crashed the party. Instead of giving a philosophical speech about love, he decided to tell everyone about his failed attempt to seduce Socrates. Picture this: the most beautiful, wealthy, and politically powerful young man in Athens, drunk off his ass, publicly confessing his unrequited love for a middle-aged philosopher who looked like a satyr and had all the sex appeal of a philosophical theorem. Alcibiades described how he'd tried everything, inviting Socrates to dinner, working out with him at the gymnasium, even climbing into bed with him naked, only to have Socrates spend the entire night discussing virtue and self-control. The audience's reaction was apparently a mixture of laughter, embarrassment, and philosophical fascination. Here was living proof of Socrates' commitment to his principles, but also a hilariously awkward moment where personal drama became public. Entertainment. It's like if someone stood up at an academic conference and gave a detailed account of being friend-zoned by their professor, except the professor was sitting right there nodding along and occasionally correcting details. Another case study that perfectly captures symposium culture involves the relationship between the poet Ibycus and a young man named Euryalus. Ibycus was known for his passionate love poetry, the kind of stuff that would make modern romance novels look restrained. At a symposium, he performed a poem comparing his love for Euryalus to being struck by lightning while standing in a field during a thunderstorm, dramatic, terrifying, and potentially fatal. The performance was so moving that other guests reportedly wept, applauded, and immediately started composing their own love poetry. But here's the twist. Euryalus was also being courted by several other men at the same symposium, turning the Vazimverse evening into a competitive poetry slam where established intellectuals were essentially having a rap battle about who loved this kid more. The winner wasn't determined by rhyme schemes or metaphorical creativity, but by which poem convinced Euryalus to choose that particular suitor. It's like if The Voice was about romantic relationships instead of singing talent, except the judges were drunk philosophers and the stakes were social status rather than record deals. The specific details that bring these stories to life are found in the protocols and rituals that govern symposium behavior. Guests would arrive wearing wreaths of flowers, recline on couches arranged in a specific order based on social hierarchy, and follow elaborate rules about when to drink, when to speak, and when to make romantic advances. There were even specific protocols for how to properly vomit if you'd had too much wine. Apparently, there were elegant and inelegant ways to lose your dinner, and getting it wrong could damage your reputation faster than a bad performance. Review. This wasn't isolated to one famous party or a few well-documented cases. The symposium culture created patterns that repeated throughout Greek society with the regularity of an ancient social media algorithm. Every important political figure, every respected philosopher, every successful merchant participated in these gatherings, and the relationships formed there influenced everything from military campaigns to artistic movements. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Older, established men would use symposiums to display their wealth, wisdom, and social connections, while younger men would attend to learn, network, and potentially find mentors or lovers. The combination of alcohol, intellectual discourse, and romantic opportunity created a social dynamic where personal relationships and professional advancement were impossible to separate. It's like if LinkedIn networking events were combined with speed dating and academic conferences, except everyone was drunk and the dress code was toga optional. Why this pattern existed goes to the heart of how Greek society functioned. In a world without formal institutions for higher education, without professional associations, and without modern communication systems, the symposium served multiple functions simultaneously. It was continuing education for adults, professional networking for ambitious young men, political organizing for civic leaders, and matchmaking for those seeking romantic partnerships. The social, political, and economic factors that created this system were all interconnected in ways that made symposiums not just entertainment, but essential infrastructure for how their civilization operated. The comparison to other time periods reveals just how unique this system was. Medieval courts had feasts and entertainments, but they were dominated by hierarchical relationships and formal protocols that left little room for the kind of intellectual discourse and romantic freedom that characterized Greek symposiums. Renaissance. Salons came closer to the Greek model, but they often included women and focused more on artistic display than on the mentorship relationships that were central to Greek culture. Modern cocktail parties and networking events serve some of the same functions, but they lack the intellectual depth and the integration of personal and professional relationships that made symposiums so influential. Even in other parts of the ancient world, nothing quite matched the Greek symposium. Roman dinner parties were more focused on displaying wealth and political power. Persian court entertainments were more formal and hierarchical, and Egyptian social gatherings were more religious in nature. The Greeks created something unique, a social institution that combined pleasure and philosophy, politics and romance, education and entertainment in ways that produced lasting cultural achievements while also providing a framework for personal relationships that could span decades. The universality of certain human desires for connection, recognition, and intellectual stimulation meant that symposium culture appealed to fundamental aspects of human nature. But the specific way Greeks structured these gatherings reflected their particular values and social organization. It was a system that could only have emerged in a society that valued both individual achievement and community participation. that saw no contradiction between physical pleasure and intellectual development, and that believed personal relationships were essential to civic life. The effects were nothing short of transformational for both individuals and society as a whole. The symposium culture created a generation of leaders who were trained not just in politics or philosophy, but in the complex art of managing personal relationships that combined emotional attachment, intellectual partnership, and social obligation. These men went on to shape everything from military strategy to artistic movements, carrying with them relationship skills and social networks that had been forged in the intimate atmosphere of wine-soaked philosophical discussions. Who benefited from this system were primarily the elite men who had access to these gatherings, the wealthy, the educated, the politically connected. For them, symposiums provided a pathway to influence that combined pleasure with advancement, allowing them to build the kinds of personal relationships that could last for decades and influence major historical events. Young men with talent but limited connections could use symposiums to gain access to mentors who could transform their life prospects, while established figures could identify and cultivate the next generation of leaders. But who suffered were those excluded from this system entirely. Women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor had no access to the networks and relationships that symposiums created. This meant that the most important decisions affecting their lives were made by men who had been selected and trained through a system that completely excluded their perspectives and interests. It's like if all major political and business decisions were made at exclusive country clubs where membership was limited to people who looked exactly like the current members. The unintended consequences included the creation of a political and intellectual culture that was remarkably sophisticated in some ways, but completely blind to the experiences of most of the population. The philosophical insights about love, friendship, and human nature that emerged from symposium culture were profound and lasting, but they were based on the experiences of a tiny elite who lived lives of leisure supported by the labor of people they rarely acknowledged as fully human. How they shape future developments can be traced through the entire history of Western education and intellectual life. The idea that learning should involve personal relationships between teachers and students, that intellectual development requires emotional engagement, and that the most important insights emerge from informal discussions rather than formal lectures. All of these concepts trace back to symposium culture. Modern university systems, graduate programs, and academic mentorship relationships are all descendants of the Greek symposium, even though most participants probably don't realize they're following a model that was developed in ancient drinking parties. The modern parallels are both inspiring and troubling. When we see exclusive networking opportunities that combine social pleasure with professional advancement, when we observe how personal relationships determine access to power and influence, when we notice how intellectual and cultural institutions perpetuate existing hierarchies while claiming to be based on merit, we're seeing echoes of symposium culture that have persisted for over 2 millennia. Yet even as symposium culture was creating these sophisticated networks of personal and professional relationships, the very success of the system was generating tensions that would ultimately challenge its foundations. The romantic relationships that were celebrated in the intimate atmosphere of private drinking parties were about to collide with the harsh realities of public life, where personal attachments could become political vulnerabilities, and where the skills learned in managing symposium relationships would be tested in the unforgiving arena of democratic politics. The transition from private symposium to public life required a different set of skills and created different pressures. What worked in the controlled environment of a carefully selected dinner party didn't always translate to the chaos of the agora, where citizens from all social classes could influence political decisions and where personal relationships were subject to public scrutiny and manipulation. The peak drama and conflicts that would emerge from this collision between private, relationship culture and public political life would reveal both the strengths and the fundamental contradictions of the Greek approach to love and power. By 415 BCE, the delicate balance between private romantic relationships and public political life in Athens had reached a breaking point that would make modern political scandals look like minor social media dust-ups. The system that had worked so beautifully in the controlled environment of gymnasiums and symposiums was about to collide headfirst with the brutal realities of democratic politics, where personal relationships could be weaponized faster than, you could say, opposition research. The situation was like a pressure cooker filled with testosterone, ambition, and enough sexual tension to power a small city-state. On one side, you had the traditional aristocratic families who had built their power through generations of carefully cultivated relationships, mentorships, and romantic alliances. On the other side, you had the emerging democratic institutions where any citizen could stand up in the assembly and demand answers about their leaders' private lives. It was like mixing oil and water, except the oil was flammable and someone was standing nearby with a torch. The tensions had been building for years. The same intimate relationships that were celebrated in private were becoming political liabilities in public. When your mentor-lover relationship with a young man could be used by your enemies to question your judgment, your loyalty, or your fitness for office, the personal had definitely become political in ways that would make modern campaign managers break out in nervous sweats. The key players involved read like a cast list for an ancient Greek political thriller. Alcibiades, still beautiful and morally flexible. Micius, the cautious general who probably wished he'd chosen a less dramatic career. And various other politicians, philosophers, and military leaders whose personal relationships were about to become very public entertainment. The stakes involved weren't just personal reputations or romantic feelings. They were talking about the fate of the Athenian Empire, military campaigns that could determine the future of Greek civilization, and political decisions that would affect hundreds of thousands of people. It's like if a reality TV show suddenly had the power to declare war, and the participants were still behaving like they were competing for roses instead of running an empire. The crisis that would expose all these tensions began with what should have been a routine religious festival, but turned into a scandal that combined political conspiracy, religious sacrilege, and enough sexual drama to fuel gossip for generations. Someone, and the identity of that someone would become a matter of life and death, had vandalized the Herms throughout Athens. These weren't just random statues. Herms were sacred markers with the head of the god, Hermes, and, shall we say, prominent male anatomy. They were placed throughout the city for protection and good luck, and vandalizing them was considered one of the most serious religious crimes possible. But this wasn't just about religious vandalism. The timing was suspicious. It happened right before Athens was supposed to launch a massive military expedition to Sicily, a campaign that could either establish Athenian dominance over the entire Mediterranean or bankrupt the city and leave it vulnerable to its enemies. The expedition was controversial enough already, with politicians arguing about whether it was a brilliant strategic move or a catastrophic overreach. Adding religious scandal to military uncertainty was like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already threatening to burn down the house. Enter Alcibiades, because of course he was involved. As one of the main supporters of the Sicilian expedition, and a guy whose personal life made modern celebrities look restrained, Alcibiades immediately became the prime suspect. His enemies in the assembly didn't need much evidence. His reputation for outrageous behavior, his network of young male lovers, and his general attitude of rules are for other people made him the perfect scapegoat. It's like being the guy who's always late to work suddenly being blamed when the office coffee machine breaks. Maybe you didn't do it, but everyone's going to assume you did based on past behavior. The accusations came fast and furious. Alcibiades wasn't just accused of vandalizing the herms. He was also charged with mocking the sacred mysteries of Eleusis at private symposiums. Apparently, he and his friends had been performing parodies of the most sacred religious rituals while drunk at dinner parties. It was like being accused of making fun of communion while hosting a bachelor party, except the penalties involved: exile, death, or having all your property confiscated. Here's where the personal relationships that had been celebrated in gymnasium and symposium culture suddenly became weapons of political destruction. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Alcibiades' former lovers, drinking companions, and mentorship circle. Young men who had been intimate with him were called to testify about what he'd said and done in private moments. Symposium guests were asked to recall conversations that had happened years earlier. The romantic and intellectual relationships that were supposed to be based on trust and mutual respect were turned into evidence for criminal prosecution. Alcibiades' response was to demand an immediate trial so he could clear his name before sailing to Sicily. It was a reasonable request. Why would you want to leave the city under a cloud of suspicion when you were supposed to be leading a military campaign? But his enemies in the assembly were too clever for that. They agreed to let him sail with the expedition, but promised to recall him for trial once the ships had left Athens. It was a trap that would make modern political operatives weep with admiration. They got rid of their most dangerous opponent while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. The moment Alcibiades realized what was happening was like watching a master chess player discover that he'd been playing checkers while his opponents were playing 4D chess. The ship that came to arrest him in Sicily found Alcibiades gone. He'd escaped in the night, leaving behind a military expedition that was now missing one of its key leaders and a political situation in Athens that was spiraling toward complete chaos. But the real drama was just beginning. Instead of returning to Athens to face trial like a good citizen, Alcibiades did what any rational person would do when facing potential execution for crimes he may or may not have committed. He defected to Sparta, Athens' greatest enemy, and offered to help them defeat the city that had raised him, educated him, and given him every opportunity to succeed. It's like if a presidential candidate who lost the election decided to join a foreign intelligence service and share state secrets, except Alcibiades actually had valuable military intelligence and a personal grudge the size of the Mediterranean. The immediate aftermath was a political and military disaster that exceeded everyone's worst-case scenarios. The Sicilian expedition, already risky, became a catastrophe without Alcibiades' leadership and local knowledge. Thousands of Athenian soldiers died, hundreds of ships were lost, and the city's military reputation was shattered. Meanwhile, Alcibiades was advising the Spartans on exactly how to attack Athens most effectively, using his intimate knowledge of Athenian politics, military strategy, and, most importantly, the personal relationships and rivalries among the leadership. The symbolic endpoint of this disaster came when Alcibiades, now working for Sparta, helped them establish a permanent military base in Attica, just a few miles from Athens. The student had become the teacher's worst nightmare, and the romantic relationships that were supposed to create loyalty and civic virtue had produced the most dangerous traitor in Athenian history. The response was a mixture of panic, outrage, and desperate attempts to assign blame that would make modern crisis management consultants reach for their strongest antacids. The immediate political consequences included the recall and execution of several other military leaders, a complete reorganization of the command structure for the Sicilian expedition, and a wave of prosecutions targeting anyone who had been associated with Alcibiades or the religious scandals. The various parties' reactions revealed just how deeply the personal had become political in Athenian society. Alcibiades' former lovers found themselves caught between loyalty to their past relationships and fear for their own safety. Some testified against him to save their own reputations. Others fled the city rather than face questioning, and a few maintained their loyalty and paid the price with exile or worse. It was like a political purge that followed the romantic network rather than ideological lines. The immediate consequences extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The Sicilian expedition's failure marked the beginning of Athens' decline as the dominant power in the Greek world. The loss of so many ships and soldiers weakened the city's military capabilities, while the financial cost of the campaign strained the treasury and forced new taxes that made Athenian citizens question whether their democratic system was worth the price. The political fallout included a complete transformation of how personal relationships were viewed in public life. The assembly began scrutinizing the private lives of political candidates with an intensity that would make modern opposition researchers look restrained. The gymnasium and symposium cultures that had produced generations of leaders were suddenly viewed with suspicion, as citizens worried that these intimate relationships created loyalty conflicts that could undermine civic duty. How this changed. Everything was visible in the immediate shift toward more formal, institutional approaches to education and political advancement. The personal mentorship relationships that had been the foundation of Greek political culture were gradually replaced by more structured systems that prioritized public accountability over private bonds. It was the beginning of the end for a system that had shaped Western civilization, brought down by the very success that had made it so influential. The ironic outcomes included the fact that Alcibiades eventually switched sides again, returning to Athens when the political winds changed and briefly becoming a hero once more before his final exile and assassination. It's like if Benedict Arnold had been forgiven, promoted, exiled again, and finally killed in a completely unrelated dispute. Except Alcibiades managed to pack even more drama into his story. This crisis wasn't just about one charismatic politician's fall from grace or the failure of a particular military campaign. It revealed fundamental tensions between individual relationships and civic institutions that every society faces when personal bonds conflict with public duties. The Alcibiades affair exposed the inherent contradiction in a system that celebrated intimate relationships while demanding absolute loyalty to the state. What it revealed about Greek society was that their integration of personal and political relationships, which had been their greatest strength, could also become their greatest vulnerability. The same mentor-student bonds that produced brilliant leaders could also create networks of loyalty that transcended civic obligations. The symposium culture that fostered intellectual development could also provide cover for activities that undermine public trust. The long-term effects included a gradual transformation of Greek political culture away from the personal relationship model toward more institutional approaches that prioritize public accountability over private bonds. Later, Greek cities would develop more formal educational systems, more structured political parties, and more bureaucratic approaches to government that reduced the influence of personal relationships in public life. Why historians still debate it is because the Alcibiades affair represents a perfect case study of how personal charisma, political ambition, and social institutions interact in ways that can either strengthen or destroy civilization. It's a story that resonates across centuries because it addresses fundamental questions about loyalty, leadership, and the relationship between private life and public service that every democratic society must grapple with around the main drama of political scandals and philosophical symposiums. A fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that reveal just how deeply these relationship patterns penetrated every level of Greek society. These weren't just background players in the Alcibiades show. They were the people who made the entire system function, sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes spectacularly badly. Pausanias, the legal expert we met at Plato's symposium, was more than just a dinner party philosopher. This guy was essentially ancient Athens' relationship counselor, except instead of having clients lie on couches talking about their feelings, he had an entire legal practice built around sorting out the complications that arose from mentor-student relationships gone wrong. Pausanias specialized in inheritance disputes involving lovers, breach of contract cases when mentorship agreements fell apart, and the occasional assault charge when romantic rivals got physical. His significance lay in showing how these relationships had become so institutionalized that they required their own legal framework. It's like if family court had a special division just for handling conflicts between sugar daddies and their protégés, except with more togas and fewer prenups. Pausanias was famous for his long-term relationship with Agathon, the tragic poet whose house hosted the symposium. Their partnership represented what the Greeks considered the ideal evolution of a mentor-student relationship. They'd started when Agathon was young and beautiful, and Pausanias was an established legal expert, but had maintained their bond for decades as Agathon developed his own career and reputation. By the time of the famous symposium, they were essentially an ancient Greek power couple, combining legal expertise with artistic achievement in ways that influenced both politics and culture. Their relationship showed how the system was supposed to work when everything went right. Lifelong partnership, mutual respect, professional collaboration, and enough social status to host dinner parties that would be remembered for millennia. Critias represented a different aspect of how these relationships could shape political development, and his story is considerably darker than Pausanias and Agathon's domestic bliss. Critias was a student of Socrates who took the philosopher's criticism of democratic institutions and ran with it in directions that probably made Socrates wish he'd stuck to less politically ambitious pupils. After studying under Socrates and forming relationships within the traditional mentor-student network, Critias became one of the 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew Athenian democracy in 404 BCE. His contribution to the narrative was showing how the intellectual and personal bonds forged in gymnasium and symposium culture could be used to undermine the very democratic system that had created them. The specific story of Critias illustrates how mentorship relationships could transmit not just knowledge and social connections, but also political ideologies that challenged the foundations of Greek society. Critias used his network of relationships, many of which had romantic or emotional components, to recruit supporters for his anti-democratic movement. He turned the trust and loyalty that were supposed to strengthen civic bonds into tools for destroying civic institutions. It's like if your graduate advisor convinced you that your university was fundamentally corrupt and then recruited you and your fellow students to burn down the administration building. Except Critias actually succeeded in overthrowing the government, at least temporarily. Xenophon showed yet another angle of how these relationships functioned across different contexts and social situations. Unlike the urban sophisticates of Athens, Xenophon was more of a military guy who took the mentor-student relationship model and applied it to warfare, exploration, and practical leadership rather than philosophy and politics. His relationship with Socrates was more about learning practical wisdom and leadership skills than about abstract philosophical concepts or romantic attachment. Xenophon represented how the Greek relationship model could be adapted to different personalities and circumstances while maintaining its essential characteristics. Xenophon's most famous contribution was his account of the 10,000 group of Greek mercenaries who had to fight their way out of Persia after their employer was killed in battle. His leadership of this desperate military campaign showed how the mentorship skills learned in peacetime Athens could be applied to life or death situations where personal relationships literally determined survival. the loyalty and trust that Xenophon had learned to build through mentor-student relationships became the foundation for keeping 10,000 soldiers together. During a retreat that lasted months and covered hundreds of miles through hostile territory. It's like if your college advisor's teaching methods turned out to be exactly what you needed to lead a group of co-workers out of a zombie apocalypse. These weren't isolated incidents scattered randomly across Greek history. They were part of an intricate web of relationships that connected politics, philosophy, military affairs, and artistic achievement in ways that made ancient Athens look like a small town where everyone was related to everyone else. Except the relationships were chosen rather than biological and often involved significantly more drama. The connections between these various figures reveal how the mentor-student relationship network functioned as the social infrastructure of Greek civilization. Pausanias and Critias both studied law and politics, but their different romantic relationships and mentorship experiences led them toward completely opposite conclusions about democracy and justice. Pausanias used his legal expertise to help people navigate the system, while Critias used similar knowledge to tear the system down. The difference wasn't just personality or political philosophy. It was also about how their personal relationships had shaped their understanding of loyalty, trust, and civic obligation. The web of relationships becomes even more complex when you follow the connections across generations. Critias was influenced by Socrates, but he also had his own students and lovers who carried his ideas forward after his death. Some of these relationships led toward continued opposition to democracy, while others evolved in completely different directions as students rebelled against their mentors' teachings. It's like a political family tree where the branches split not based on blood relationships but on intellectual and romantic partnerships that could either reinforce or completely contradict each other. How one event led to another through these personal networks can be traced through specific examples that show the butterfly effect of ancient Greek relationships. When Alcibiades defected to Sparta, he didn't just take military secrets. He took knowledge about the personal relationships and rivalries among Athenian leaders that he'd gained through his network of lovers and mentors. This information allowed the Spartans to target specific individuals for bribes, threats, or psychological warfare. One romantic relationship could provide intelligence that influenced entire military campaigns. The unintended consequences and connections often appeared years or even decades after the original relationships were formed. A young man who studied under a particular philosopher might later become a military leader whose strategic decisions were influenced by ideas he'd learned during intimate conversations at symposiums. A romantic relationship that ended badly in youth could resurface as a political rivalry that influenced major policy decisions. The personal grudges and loyalties formed in gymnasium and symposium culture didn't fade away when people grew older. They evolved into the political and intellectual networks that shaped the entire civilization. Political and social networks operated through these relationships in ways that made formal institutions almost secondary. The real decisions about war and peace, about artistic patronage, about philosophical schools and their funding, about trade partnerships and military alliances. All of these were influenced by personal relationships that had often begun as mentorships or romantic attachments. It was like if all major business and political decisions were made through a combination of LinkedIn, Tinder, and alumni networks. Except the networking events involved more wine and fewer clothes. The most fascinating aspect of these interconnected stories is how they reveal the sheer complexity of trying to separate public and private life in a society where personal relationships were the primary mechanism for transmitting power, knowledge, and cultural values. When Xenophon wrote his accounts of military campaigns, he wasn't just recording strategic decisions. He was documenting how personal loyalty and trust often rooted in romantic or mentorship relationships, determined whether soldiers would follow orders, whether allies could be trusted, and whether political agreements would be honored. These connections crossed every boundary that modern people might expect to limit personal relationships. Social class, age, political affiliation, philosophical school, military service, artistic achievement, none of these categories were as important as the personal bonds that connected individuals across all these different areas of life. A poor but brilliant young man could gain access to the highest levels of society through a relationship with the right mentor, while a wealthy aristocrat could lose everything if his personal relationships put him on the wrong side of a political conflict. To understand how these relationships functioned, you have to understand that ancient Greek society operated on completely different assumptions about privacy, individuality, and the relationship between personal and public life than anything we recognize today. Daily life in Athens wasn't divided into separate spheres where you had your work life, your family life, your romantic life, and your civic duties neatly compartmentalized like items in a modern person's calendar app. Instead, all of these aspects of existence were thoroughly integrated in ways that would make modern people feel claustrophobic and ancient. Greeks feel like modern people were living incomplete, fragmented lives. The beliefs and attitudes that shaped this integration started with the fundamental Greek concept that human beings were political animals, not in the sense that everyone was obsessed with elections and policy debates, but in the deeper sense that individual identity and personal fulfillment were impossible outside of community relationships. They literally couldn't conceive of self-development that didn't involve intimate connections with other people, and they couldn't imagine public life that wasn't built on personal trust and affection. Social structures reflected these beliefs in ways that made mentor-student relationships not just common but essential for anyone who wanted to participate fully in Greek civilization. The gymnasium wasn't an optional recreational facility. It was where citizens learned the physical, intellectual, and social skills necessary for civic participation. The symposium wasn't just entertainment. It was where political alliances were formed, where cultural values were transmitted, and where the next generation of leaders was identified and cultivated. What was normal versus exceptional in this context would surprise modern observers in both directions. On one hand, romantic relationships between men of different ages were so normal that not participating in this culture could actually damage a young man's prospects for advancement. On the other hand, these relationships were governed by such complex social expectations and formal protocols that getting them wrong could result in social exile or political ruin. It was simultaneously more open and more restrictive than modern relationship cultures. How this shaped events becomes clear when you realize that major political decisions, military strategies, and cultural movements all emerged from networks of personal relationships that included romantic and emotional components. The philosophical schools that produced the ideas that still influence Western thought were organized around personal attachments between teachers and students. The political alliances that determined war and peace were based on trust and loyalty that often had romantic origins. The artistic patronage that created the cultural achievements we still admire was funded through relationships that combined intellectual admiration, social ambition, and personal affection. The daily reality of this system meant that a young Athenian citizen couldn't simply choose to focus on his career or his personal life. Success in any area required building and maintaining relationships that crossed all boundaries between public and private, professional and personal, intellectual and emotional. It was a society where networking was literally intimate, where mentorship was often romantic, and where personal loyalty was the foundation of political power. Perhaps most deliciously ironic was how a culture that celebrated the pursuit of wisdom and virtue through intimate relationships produce some of the most spectacular examples of betrayal, manipulation, and moral corruption in ancient history. The same system that gave us Socratic philosophy and Platonic ideals also gave us Alcibiades' defection and Critias' tyranny. It's like if a monastery dedicated to peace and spiritual development kept producing master criminals and international arms dealers. Examples of contradictions are everywhere once you start looking for them. The Greeks celebrated physical beauty and athletic achievement while simultaneously insisting that true love was about spiritual and intellectual connection. They created elaborate protocols to ensure that mentor-student relationships were based on virtue and wisdom, then used those same relationships for political networking and economic advancement. They praised loyalty and faithfulness in their literature, while tolerating and even expecting romantic partnerships to evolve and change as people matured. How things weren't what they seemed becomes apparent when you realize that this sacred relationships that were supposed to elevate both partners above base physical desires often functioned as sophisticated systems for managing sexual access, economic opportunity, and social status. The philosophical discussions that were supposed to focus on abstract truth often served as elaborate courtship rituals or political strategy sessions. The mentorship that was supposed to be about selfless guidance of the young was frequently about older men maintaining their relevance and influence as they aged. Modern parallels to these contradictions include any situation where idealistic institutions become vehicles for the very behaviors they're supposed to prevent or transform. It's like if dating apps that promise to find true love became primarily tools for casual hookups, or if networking organizations dedicated to professional development became mainly social clubs for people who already had connections. The Greeks created a beautiful theory about how personal relationships could serve higher purposes, but the practice was inevitably messier, more self-interested, and more complicated than the theory suggested. Everything changed when the Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BCE with Athens' humiliating defeat, leaving the city-state that had pioneered democracy looking like a deflated balloon at a particularly depressing birthday party. The military disaster wasn't just about losing ships and soldiers. It was about the complete failure of a political and social system that had been built on personal relationships, individual charisma, and the assumption that brilliant people making decisions based on personal loyalty would somehow produce better results than boring institutional processes. The background to this transformation goes deeper than military defeat. The war had lasted nearly 3 decades, long enough for an entire generation to grow up knowing nothing but conflict, uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of the social bonds that had made the mentor-student relationship system work. Young men who should have been forming lifelong attachments with older mentors were instead watching their potential guides die in battle, flee into exile, or disappear into the political chaos that consumed Athens during its final years as a Podeus, as a Kyle of years as a peer into the political chaos that consumed Athens during its final years as a major power. Why this moment was different from previous crises becomes clear when you realize that earlier challenges to the Greek relationship system had come from external enemies or individual scandals, but this was a systemic collapse that called into question every assumption about how society should function. Previous problems could be blamed on bad individuals making poor choices, but the defeat by Sparta had been engineered partly by Alcibiades, a product of the very mentorship system that was supposed to create loyal citizens. It's like if your most successful graduate turned around and used everything you taught them to destroy your entire program, except the consequences affected hundreds of thousands of people rather than just one department. The key factors that led to this transformation included the emergence of professional armies that didn't rely on personal loyalty between commanders and soldiers. The development of more sophisticated economic systems that reduced dependence on personal networks for business relationships, and the influence of philosophical schools that began questioning whether personal attachment was really the best foundation for political decision-making. But perhaps most importantly, the defeat had revealed that the romantic and mentorship relationships that were supposed to create unbreakable bonds of loyalty could actually become sources of vulnerability when those relationships crossed political or military lines. When your former student is advising your enemies on how to defeat you, when your romantic partner has access to military secrets that could be used against your city, when your political allies are chosen based on personal affection rather than competence or shared values, these relationships become liabilities rather than assets. The practical reality was that Athens could no longer afford a system where major decisions were made by people whose primary qualifications were their ability to form intense personal relationships with other members of the elite. The city needed administrators who could manage complex logistical challenges, diplomats who could negotiate with foreign powers based on clear interests rather than personal charm, and military leaders who could inspire loyalty through professional competence rather than romantic charisma. It was the beginning of a shift toward what we might recognize as more modern, bureaucratic approaches to governance, except the transition was messier and more traumatic than any modern organizational restructuring. How this change unfolded was like watching a beautiful but impractical machine slowly break down and get replaced by something more efficient but considerably less elegant. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades of gradual adjustments, false starts, and partial reversals before Greek society settled into new patterns that would influence the entire ancient world. Resistance to change came primarily from the aristocratic families who had built their power and identity around the traditional mentorship system. These weren't just people who were nostalgic for the good old days. They were individuals whose entire social position, economic prospects, and personal relationships were tied to institutions that were rapidly becoming obsolete. Imagine if your entire career, social circle, and romantic life were all based on a particular technology, and then that technology was suddenly replaced by something completely different that made all your expertise irrelevant. The resistance took multiple forms, from political movements aimed at restoring the old systems to philosophical schools that argued for the superiority of personal relationships over institutional structures. Some aristocrats tried to maintain the traditional mentorship culture in private while adapting to new public requirements, leading to a kind of social code switching where people behaved one way in their personal circles and completely differently in public life. It's like if you had to use different relationship rules for work and for your personal life, except the stakes were much higher and the boundaries were constantly shifting. Champions of change included a new generation of politicians and intellectuals who had grown up during the war years and were less attached to the romantic idealization of the old system. These reformers weren't necessarily opposed to personal relationships in politics, but they were more focused on creating institutions that could function effectively, regardless of who was sleeping with whom. They represented a more pragmatic approach that prioritized results over process and competence over charisma. The specific steps and stages of transformation can be traced through changes in educational practices, legal codes, and political procedures. The gymnasium culture gradually became more focused on physical training and less on romantic mentorship, with formal instructors replacing personal mentors for many subjects. The symposium tradition continued, but evolved into more structured social events with less emphasis on intimate personal relationships and more focus on intellectual discourse and political networking. Obstacles encountered included the practical challenge of replacing a system that had worked reasonably well for centuries with something completely new and untested. The personal relationship model had produced genuine achievements, brilliant military leaders, innovative philosophers, successful artists, and writers, creating new institutions that could identify and develop talent without relying on intimate personal bonds required experimentation and adaptation that took generations to perfect. Breakthrough moments included the development of more formal educational institutions, the creation of professional administrative positions that were filled based on competence rather than personal connections, and the establishment of legal frameworks that could handle complex social and economic relationships without requiring judges to understand the romantic history of everyone involved. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving this change is particularly fascinating because the transformation was both deeply personal and broadly systemic. Individual choices by specific people, decisions about relationships, career paths, political allegiances, combined with larger forces like economic development, military technology, and demographic changes to create new social patterns that no one had specifically planned or designed. Some individuals became symbols of the new approach. Leaders who succeeded through institutional competence rather than personal charisma. Philosophers who developed ethical systems based on abstract principles rather than personal relationships. Artists who created works that appealed to broad audiences rather than intimate circles of patrons and lovers. But these individual success stories were only possible because of broader changes in how society functioned. The gradual nature of this transformation meant that different aspects of the old system disappeared at different rates and for different reasons. The romantic mentorship relationships that had been central to education and political development became less common and less influential, but they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they evolved into new forms that were more compatible with institutional structures and public accountability. By the end of this process, Greek society had developed what modern observers might recognize as more familiar approaches to education, politics, and social organization. Personal relationships remained important, but they were no longer the primary mechanism for transmitting power, knowledge, and cultural values. The intimate connections that had shaped earlier Greek civilization were gradually replaced by more formal, institutional relationships that could function at larger scales and with greater consistency. The new system that emerged from this transformation was like replacing a handcrafted luxury car with a mass-produced vehicle. It was more reliable, more accessible, and more practical, but it definitely lacked some of the elegance and sophistication that had made the original so memorable. Greek society in the 4th century BCE looked fundamentally different from the Athens of Pericles and Socrates. Even though many of the same institutions and cultural practices continued in modified forms, how things were different becomes apparent when you compare the career paths available to young men in the new system versus the old. Instead of seeking out a particular mentor whose personal relationship would determine their future prospects, ambitious young Greeks could now pursue formal education in established schools, compete for positions in professional institutions, and advance based on demonstrated competence in specific skills rather than their ability to maintain intimate personal relationships with older patrons. The gymnasium culture that had been the foundation of the old system was transformed into something that would be more recognizable to modern observers. Physical training became more systematic and less personal, with professional trainers replacing mentor lovers as the primary source of instruction. Intellectual education moved into more formal schools where curricula were standardized and students were evaluated based on their mastery of specific subjects rather than their personal relationships with teachers. Who won and who lost from these changes reflects the broader social transformation that was reshaping the entire ancient world. The winners included people with professional skills who could succeed in institutional environments. Administrators, teachers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and military officers who could advance based on competence rather than personal connections. The new system created opportunities for people who might have been excluded from the old mentor-student networks due to their social background, family connections, or personal appearance. The losers were primarily the aristocratic families who had built their power around personal relationship networks. Without the ability to control access to education and advancement through intimate mentorship relationships, these traditional elites found their influence diminished and their social status challenged by people who succeeded through institutional, rather than personal means. New rules and norms developed around professional behavior, educational standards, and political accountability that would have seemed foreign to earlier generations of Greeks. The idea that public officials should be evaluated based on their job performance rather than their personal relationships, that teachers should maintain appropriate boundaries with students, that business partnerships should be based on contracts, rather than romantic attachment. These concepts required new social skills and different expectations about how people should behave in various contexts. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the complexity of this social transformation. Greek culture retained its emphasis on excellence, competition, and intellectual achievement, but these values were now pursued through different mechanisms and according to different rules. Philosophy, literature, and art continued to flourish, but they were supported by different patronage systems and created by people who had been trained in different ways. The most dramatic change was probably the shift from a society where personal relationships were the primary determinant of success to one where institutional position and professional competence became increasingly important. This wasn't just about different career paths or educational systems. It was about a fundamental change in how people understood the relationship between individual identity and social function. The persistence of certain elements from the old system, however, shows that this transformation was more about adaptation than complete replacement. Personal relationships remained important in Greek society, but they functioned within new frameworks that provided more structure, more accountability, and more opportunities for people who might have been excluded from the traditional mentor-student networks. Was this change ultimately positive or negative for Greek civilization? The answer depends partly on what you value and partly on what timeline you're considering, but mostly on whether you think the benefits of institutional stability and broader access to opportunities outweighed the loss of the intimate, personalized approach to education and social development that had produced some of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Different perspectives on this transformation reveal the complexity of trying to evaluate major social changes. From the viewpoint of people who had succeeded under the old system, the changes represented a decline from a golden age of personal excellence and cultural achievement to a more bureaucratic, impersonal approach that might be more fair, but was definitely less inspiring. From the perspective of people who had been excluded from the traditional networks, the new system offered opportunities that would have been impossible under the mentor-student relationship model. Short-term versus long-term effects showed different patterns of success and failure. In the immediate aftermath of the transformation, Greek society became more stable and predictable, but it also became less innovative and dynamic. The institutional approaches that replaced personal mentorship were better at maintaining existing knowledge and skills, but they were less effective at producing the kind of breakthrough thinking and cultural creativity that had characterized earlier periods. The unintended consequences of this change included the gradual separation of intellectual, political, and romantic life into distinct spheres the previous generations would have found artificial and limiting. The new system was more efficient and more fair, but it was also more fragmented and less personally fulfilling for many people who had to navigate multiple sets of relationships and expectations rather than integrating all aspects of their lives. Through a few key personal bonds, modern judgment versus Contemporary reviews reveals interesting differences in how we evaluate these changes. Contemporary Greeks who lived through the transformation often expressed nostalgia for the old system and concern about the impersonal nature of the new institutions. Modern observers, influenced by our own assumptions about appropriate relationships between teachers and students, public officials and citizens, tend to view the changes as progress toward more professional and ethical standards. The most honest evaluation is probably that this transformation involved genuine gains and losses that affected different people in different ways, and that the long-term consequences included both positive developments that we still benefit from and the loss of approaches to human relationship and social organization that contain valuable insights we're still trying to recover. In the years and decades that followed the transformation of Greek relationship culture, what emerged was a civilization that managed to be simultaneously more sophisticated and less interesting than what had come before, like watching a wild jazz improvisation gradually evolve into a perfectly competent but predictable classical symphony. The new challenges facing Greek society weren't about managing the complications of intimate mentor-student relationships. They were about maintaining cultural creativity and social cohesion in a world where personal bonds have been largely replaced by institutional structures. The evolution of the situation created what historians might call the Hellenistic compromise, a system that preserved some elements of traditional Greek culture while adapting to the political and social realities of a world increasingly dominated by large kingdoms and professional bureaucracies. Instead of small city-states where everyone knew everyone else's romantic history, Greeks now lived in vast empires where personal relationships still mattered, but they functioned within formal frameworks that would have seemed foreign to earlier generations. New challenges emerged that the original mentor-student relationship system had never been designed to handle. How do you maintain Greek cultural identity when Greek communities are scattered across 3 continents? How do you preserve the intellectual traditions that had emerged from intimate personal relationships when education has become a mass enterprise? How do you create loyalty and social cohesion in diverse cosmopolitan cities where people might never encounter the kind of small, intimate communities where the old system had flourished? The second-generation effects of the transformation included the gradual emergence of what we might recognize as more modern approaches to education, politics, and social organization. Schools became institutions rather than extensions of particular teachers' personalities. Political careers became professional pathways rather than networks of personal loyalties. Business relationships became contractual arrangements rather than extensions of romantic or mentorship bonds. But perhaps the most significant second-generation effect was the development of new forms of cultural expression that tried to capture what had been lost in the transformation. Hellenistic literature, art, and philosophy became increasingly focused on themes of nostalgia, individual psychology, and the search for personal meaning in an impersonal world. It's like if an entire civilization developed therapy culture because they were trying to process the collective trauma of becoming more efficient but less personally fulfilling. The practical consequences of these changes could be seen in everything, from military organization to artistic patronage. Armies became more professional and less dependent on personal bonds between commanders and soldiers, but they also became less motivated and less creative in their tactics. Artistic achievement continued, but it was increasingly supported by royal patronage and institutional funding, rather than emerging from intimate circles of lovers and mentors who inspired each other to greater achievements. The most fascinating aspect of this aftermath was how Greeks themselves understood what was happening to their culture. They were aware that they were living through a transformation that was making their society more stable and more fair, but also less dynamic and less personally satisfying. This self-consciousness about cultural change created a kind of reflexive awareness that influenced everything from philosophical speculation to personal life choices, as individuals tried to find ways to maintain meaningful relationships within institutional frameworks that weren't really designed to support the kind of intimate connections that had previously been central to Greek life. The institutional transformation of Greek society created space for new types of people to become influential, and their emergence reveals just how dramatically the social landscape had changed from the days when personal relationships with older mentors determined almost everything about a young man's prospects. These new players brought different skills, different values, and different approaches to the challenges of maintaining Greek culture in a rapidly changing world. Professional educators emerged as a distinct class of people whose authority came from their mastery of specific subjects rather than their ability to form intimate relationships with students. These teachers developed systematic approaches to instruction that could be applied consistently across different students and different contexts. Unlike the traditional mentors, whose teaching methods were inseparable from their personal relationships, with particular students, professional educators created curricula, wrote textbooks, and established standards that allowed knowledge to be transmitted more efficiently and to more people. Their roles differed dramatically from earlier mentors in ways that would have made Socrates weep into his hemlock. Instead of engaging each student as a unique individual whose education was inseparable from a personal relationship, professional teachers treated students as members of classes who were all working towards similar learning objectives. Instead of combining intellectual, emotional, and often physical intimacy in a single relationship, professional educators maintained clear boundaries between their teaching responsibilities and their personal lives. How they differed from earlier players becomes clear when you compare their career paths and social positions. Traditional mentors had been wealthy citizens who took on students as part of their civic obligations and personal fulfillment, often without any formal compensation. Beyond the social status and companionship that successful mentoring provided, professional educators, by contrast, were people who made their living by teaching, which meant they had to develop skills in managing larger groups, standardizing instruction, and maintaining relationships with institutional employers rather than individual patrons. Royal administrators represented another new type of influential figure who emerged as Greek communities became part of larger kingdoms ruled by Macedonian and later Roman overlords. These administrators combined Greek cultural background with professional skills in managing complex bureaucracies, military logistics, and economic systems that operated on scales far beyond anything the old city-states had attempted. Their contributions to Greek society included the development of new approaches to law, engineering, and economic organization that preserved Greek intellectual traditions while adapting them to the practical requirements of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Specific stories about these new administrators reveal how they navigated the tension between maintaining their Greek identity and serving foreign rulers whose values and priorities were often quite different from traditional Greek approaches. Philosophical entrepreneurs created another category of new players who adapted traditional Greek intellectual culture to the demands of a more cosmopolitan, institutionalized world. Unlike earlier philosophers who had taught small groups of devoted students in intimate settings, these new figures created philosophical schools that functioned more like modern universities, with formal admission requirements, standardized curricula, and systematic approaches to intellectual development. Their contributions included the development of philosophical systems that could be taught to large numbers of students without requiring the kind of intense personal relationships that had characterized earlier Greek intellectual culture. The Stoics, Epicureans, and other Hellenistic philosophical schools created approaches to ethics, psychology, and social organization that could be learned through books and lectures rather than through intimate mentorship relationships. But perhaps, most importantly, these new players created institutional frameworks that allowed Greek culture to survive and influence the broader ancient world even after the political and social conditions that had originally created it had disappeared. Their success in adapting Greek traditions to new circumstances ensured that ideas and values that had emerged from the intimate mentor-student relationship culture of classical Athens would continue to influence Western civilization for centuries, albeit in forms that would have seemed foreign to the original creators. But some problems persisted with the stubborn determination of philosophical questions that refused to be answered by institutional solutions, no matter how well designed those institutions might be. The transformation of Greek society had solved many of the practical difficulties that had plagued the old mentor-student relationship system, but it had also created new challenges that proved surprisingly resistant to bureaucratic fixes. Continuing, challenges included the fundamental question of how to maintain cultural creativity and intellectual innovation in a system that prioritized consistency and standardization over the kind of intimate, personal relationships that had previously sparked breakthrough thinking. The new educational institutions were excellent at transmitting existing knowledge and maintaining cultural traditions, but they were less effective at producing the kind of revolutionary insights that had characterized classical Greek philosophy, mathematics, and political theory. What didn't get resolved was the tension between efficiency and inspiration that had been built into the dead original transformation. The institutional approaches that replaced personal mentorship were undeniably more fair, more accessible, and more reliable, but they were also more predictable and less likely to produce the kind of unexpected connections and creative syntheses that had emerged from the chaotic but productive world of gymnasium and symposium culture. New versions of old problems appeared as institutional structures created their own forms of favoritism, exclusion, and power abuse. Instead of older men exploiting their relationships with younger mentees, you had administrators favoring certain students or teachers, wealthy patrons influencing educational and cultural institutions through financial pressure, and professional relationships that combined personal attraction with career advancement in ways that recreated many of the complications that institutions had been designed to eliminate. Cyclical patterns emerged as each generation rediscovered the appeal of more personal, intimate approaches to education and cultural development, leading to periodic attempts to revive aspects of the traditional mentor-student relationship model. These revivals never fully succeeded in restoring the old system, but they created ongoing tension between institutional and personal approaches that influenced Greek culture for centuries. The persistence of certain problems reveals something fundamental about human nature and social organization that institutional solutions alone cannot address. People continue to crave the kind of meaningful personal relationships that have been central to earlier Greek culture, but the social and political conditions that had supported those relationships no longer existed. This created a kind of cultural nostalgia that influenced everything from artistic themes to personal life choices. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clearer when you realize that they involved fundamental questions about human motivation, creativity, and social connection that every civilization has to grapple with in some form. How do you balance individual fulfillment with social efficiency? How do you maintain cultural innovation while ensuring fair access to opportunities? How do you create meaningful relationships in institutional settings that aren't designed to support intimacy? The most persistent problem was probably the gradual separation of intellectual, emotional, and social development into distinct spheres that had to be managed through different institutions and relationships. This fragmentation created more opportunities for more people, but it also made it harder for individuals to develop the kind of integrated understanding of themselves and their society that had characterized the best products of the traditional mentorship system. These ongoing issues influenced later developments in ways that can be traced through the entire history of Western education and social organization. The tension between personal and institutional approaches to learning, the challenges of maintaining creativity within bureaucratic structures, the difficulties of creating meaningful relationships in professional contexts, all of these problems that emerged from the transformation of Greek society continue to influence how we think about education, politics, and social organization today. Compared to earlier periods of Greek history, the post-transformation society achieved greater stability and broader access to opportunities, but it also displayed less cultural dynamism and individual creativity than the classical period that had produced Socrates, Plato, and the other figures we still remember today. The comparison reveals both the benefits and the costs of institutional approaches to social organization that prioritize fairness and efficiency over personal relationships and individual brilliance. What was unique about the Greek transformation was how consciously it was undertaken and how thoroughly it was implemented. Unlike other ancient civilizations that evolved gradually or were conquered by foreign powers, the Greeks deliberately chose to modify their social institutions in response to political and military challenges. This conscious adaptation created a model for how societies could transform themselves while preserving essential cultural values, but it also demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining cultural creativity within institutional frameworks. What was universal about the Greek experience becomes apparent when you compare it to similar transformations in other civilizations. The tension between personal relationships and institutional efficiency, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity during periods of rapid change, the difficulty of creating meaningful opportunities for individual fulfillment within systems designed for mass participation. These problems appear in different forms in every society that undergoes modernization or institutional development. Lessons that could be learned from the Greek experience include both positive and negative examples of how to manage social transformation. The Greeks demonstrated that it was possible to adapt traditional institutions to new circumstances without completely abandoning cultural values. But they also showed how difficult it was to maintain the personal relationships and individual creativity that had made their culture distinctive. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in the ancient world include the gradual replacement of personal patronage systems with institutional structures, the development of professional classes that mediated between traditional elites and broader populations, and the emergence of new forms of cultural expression that reflected the psychological and social challenges of living in more complex, impersonal societies. The most important comparative insight is probably that the Greek transformation represented an early example of a process that every successful civilization eventually undergoes: the shift from social organization based on personal relationships to systems based on institutional structures and professional roles. The Greeks were pioneers in this transformation, and their experiences provide valuable insights into both the opportunities and the challenges that such changes create for individual fulfillment and cultural achievement. By the 2nd century BCE, signs pointed to the final transformation of traditional Greek relationship culture into something that would be almost unrecognizable to Socrates, Plato, or even the reformed educational institutions of the early Hellenistic period. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were about as obvious as a philosophical argument delivered by someone who'd clearly had too much wine and not enough sleep. The intimate mentor-student relationships that had once shaped Western civilization were being systematically replaced by Roman administrative efficiency, Christian moral frameworks, and economic systems that had no patience for the kind of personal bonds that took decades to develop and couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. The warning signs included the gradual replacement of Greek educational institutions with Roman practical training programs that focused on producing administrators, lawyers and military officers rather than philosophers and artists. The gymnasium culture that had survived in modified forms for centuries was being transformed into something that resembled modern vocational schools, more than the intellectual and romantic hothouses that had produced classical Greek culture. What? Key players could see verses. What they missed reveals the complex awareness and blindness that often characterizes the end of historical eras. Greek intellectuals were painfully aware that their culture was changing in fundamental ways, and many of them wrote extensively about the loss of traditional values and the challenges of maintaining Greek identity in an increasingly Roman world. But they often misunderstood the deeper forces driving these changes, focusing on surface issues like language and customs while missing the economic and political transformations that were making their entire social system obsolete. Resistance to inevitable change took multiple forms, from nostalgic attempts to revive classical institutions to philosophical movements that tried to preserve Greek approaches to education and personal development within Roman frameworks. Some wealthy Greeks continued to practice modified versions of traditional mentorship relationships, creating private schools and cultural centers that maintained aspects of the old system while adapting to new political realities. But the resistance was fighting against forces much larger and more systematic than individual preferences or cultural nostalgia. The Roman approach to governance, military organization, and economic development was simply incompatible with the kind of intimate, personal relationship networks that had characterized Greek society. Roman institutions were designed to function efficiently across vast territories with diverse populations, and they couldn't accommodate the kind of individualized, relationship-based approaches that had made Greek culture distinctive. The most poignant aspect of this resistance was how it revealed the genuine value of what was being lost. The attempts to preserve traditional Greek educational and social practices weren't just conservative nostalgia. They were efforts to maintain approaches to human development and cultural creativity that had produced remarkable achievements, and that couldn't easily be replaced by institutional alternatives. The gradual nature of this transformation meant that different aspects of Greek relationship culture disappeared at different rates and for different reasons. The romantic mentorship relationships that had been central to classical Greek education were among the first to disappear, replaced by more formal teacher-student relationships that maintained clear professional boundaries. The symposium culture lasted longer, but evolved into social gatherings that emphasized networking and entertainment rather than the intellectual and romantic intensity that had characterized earlier periods. How the era ended wasn't with a dramatic final scene or a specific moment when everyone suddenly realized that Greek relationship culture was over. It was more like watching a beautiful sunset that gradually fades into twilight until you suddenly realize it's completely dark and you can't remember exactly when the sun disappeared. The final transformation of Greek social institutions happened through a combination of political conquest, religious conversion, and economic development that systematically eliminated the conditions that had supported traditional Greek approaches to education, politics, and personal relationships. The specific events that marked the end included the Roman conquest of the last independent Greek kingdoms, which eliminated the political autonomy that had allowed Greek communities to maintain their distinctive social practices. But more importantly, the gradual spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire created new moral frameworks that were fundamentally incompatible with the mentor-student relationship traditions that had characterized classical Greek culture. Final major players in this transformation included Roman administrators who implemented new legal codes that regulated relationships between teachers and students, Christian bishops who condemned traditional Greek educational practices as morally corrupt, and economic entrepreneurs who created new forms of commercial and professional relationships that replaced the personal networks that had previously determined access to opportunities and advancement. The last attempts to preserve traditional Greek relationship culture were both heroic and futile, like trying to maintain a beautiful but impractical vintage car in a world that had moved on to mass-produced vehicles with standardized parts and professional repair services. The Emperor Julian's attempt to revive classical Greek education in the 4th century CE represented perhaps the most ambitious effort to restore traditional institutions, but it lasted only a few years and demonstrated how thoroughly the social and cultural foundations for those institutions had been eroded. Dramatic final moments included the closing of Plato's Academy in 529 CE by the Christian Emperor Justinian, which represented the symbolic end of an educational tradition that had lasted for nearly 1,000 years. But the academy that was closed bore little resemblance to the institution that Plato had founded. It had already been transformed multiple times to adapt to changing political and cultural circumstances, and its final closure was more like putting a beloved pet out of its misery than destroying something that was still vital and creative. The gradual decline versus dramatic endings reveals how historical transformations actually work versus how we like to imagine them. There was no single moment when Greek relationship culture ended, no specific day when the last mentor-student relationship concluded, no final symposium where everyone realized they were participating in something that would never happen again. Instead, there was a gradual process of adaptation, modification, and replacement that took centuries and that left traces and influences that persisted long after the original institutions had disappeared. The symbolic endpoints are easier to identify in retrospect than they were to recognize at the time. The transformation of the gymnasium from a center of intellectual and romantic life into a simple athletic facility, the evolution of the symposium from a sophisticated cultural institution into casual dinner parties, the replacement of personal mentorship relationships with formal educational programs. These changes happened gradually and were often presented as improvements or modernizations rather than endings. Perhaps the most accurate way to understand how this era ended is to recognize that it didn't really end so much as it evolved into something completely different. The values, ideas, and approaches to human development that had characterized Greek relationship culture were preserved and transmitted through new institutions and practices. But they were so thoroughly transformed in the process that the original culture became essentially unrecognizable. The final irony is that many of the institutions that replaced traditional Greek relationship culture, Christian monasteries, Roman law schools, medieval universities, were themselves influenced by Greek ideas about education, personal development, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and social responsibility. The Greeks had created approaches to human development that were so valuable that they continued to influence Western civilization for centuries. But those approaches had to be completely reimagined and restructured to survive in new social and cultural contexts. The analysis of causes behind this transformation reveals a complex interaction of internal problems and external pressures that made the traditional Greek relationship system increasingly unsustainable in the changing ancient world. Understanding why it ended requires looking beyond simple explanations, like the Romans conquered Greece or Christianity replaced paganism, to examine the deeper social, economic, and cultural forces that made traditional Greek institutions obsolete. Internal problems had been building for centuries and included the gradual breakdown of the social conditions that had made intimate mentor-student relationships both possible and beneficial. The small-scale face-to-face communities where everyone knew everyone else's family background, romantic history, and personal reputation had been replaced by large, cosmopolitan cities where such intimate knowledge was impossible to maintain. The economic systems that had supported the leisure class, who could afford to spend years developing personal relationships with students, had been transformed by commercial development that required more immediate and measurable returns on investment. External pressures included not just military conquest, but the emergence of new forms of political organization that operated on scales incompatible with personal relationship networks. The Roman Empire required administrative systems that could function consistently across different cultures and languages, military organizations that could integrate soldiers from diverse backgrounds, and legal frameworks that could resolve disputes without requiring judges to understand the personal relationships and cultural contexts of everyone involved. The role of individuals versus historical forces in this transformation is particularly interesting because it reveals how personal choices and larger social trends reinforced each other in ways that accelerated change. Individual decisions by Greek leaders to adopt Roman practices, by wealthy families to educate their children in Roman schools, by young men to pursue careers in Roman institutions. These personal choices both reflected and contributed to broader transformations that made traditional Greek institutions less relevant and less viable. What could have been done differently is a fascinating counterfactual question that reveals how historical change actually works. Could traditional Greek relationship culture have been preserved if Greek political leaders had made different choices? Could it have been adapted more successfully to Roman political frameworks? Could Christian and Greek educational traditions have been integrated in ways that preserved more of the original system? The evidence suggests that some aspects of traditional Greek culture could have been preserved more successfully, but that the fundamental transformation was probably inevitable given the larger forces at work. The small-scale, personal relationship networks that had characterized classical Greek society were simply incompatible with the political, economic, and social requirements of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Inevitability versus contingency in this transformation reflects broader questions about how historical change works and whether alternative outcomes were possible. Some aspects of the change, particularly the replacement of small city-states with large empires, were probably inevitable given military technology, economic development, and demographic pressures that were beyond the control of any individual, leaders, or institutions. But other aspects, particularly the specific ways that Greek educational and cultural traditions were preserved or abandoned, were more contingent and could have developed differently if different choices had been made by key individuals and institutions. The complete rejection of traditional mentor-student relationships, for example, was influenced by Christian moral frameworks that weren't themselves inevitable and that varied significantly in different regions and time periods. The most honest assessment is probably that the end of traditional Greek relationship culture was neither completely inevitable nor entirely contingent, but resulted from a complex interaction of larger historical forces and specific individual choices that reinforced each other in ways that made transformation unavoidable while leaving the specific outcomes open to influence by human agency and decision-making. The immediate aftermath of the end of traditional Greek relationship culture was a period of cultural confusion and institutional experimentation that lasted several centuries as different groups tried to figure out what to preserve, what to abandon, and what to create new from the ruins of the old system. It was like the cultural equivalent of a massive home renovation, where you're not sure which walls are load-bearing and which ones you can safely remove without bringing down the entire structure. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of traditional Greek institutions were primarily Roman administrators and Christian religious leaders, but also a diverse collection of educators, philosophers, and cultural entrepreneurs who tried to maintain aspects of Greek intellectual tradition within new institutional frameworks. These transitional figures created hybrid institutions that combined Roman organizational efficiency with Greek intellectual content, Christian moral frameworks with classical educational methods. Short-term consequences included the preservation of Greek literature, philosophy, and artistic traditions through translation projects, educational programs, and cultural institutions that maintained classical learning while adapting it to new social and political contexts. The immediate contemporary reactions varied dramatically depending on social position, religious affiliation, and cultural background, ranging from enthusiastic embrace of new opportunities to nostalgic mourning for lost traditions. Attempts at revival or continuation included the establishment of new schools and cultural centers that tried to maintain aspects of traditional Greek education, but these efforts were generally unsuccessful in restoring the intimate, personal relationship networks that had characterized the original system. Instead, they created new forms of cultural institution that preserved some Greek content while operating according to completely different social and organizational principles. The legacy of ancient Greek relationship culture shaped later developments in ways that most people would never suspect, like discovering that your favorite modern coffee shop is actually built on the foundation of a medieval monastery. The original structure is completely gone, but it's still influencing the layout of the building and the flow of daily life in subtle but important ways. The mentor-student relationship model that had been central to classical Greek education became the hidden blueprint for virtually every form of personalized instruction, professional mentorship, and intellectual development that followed, even when the romantic and emotional components were completely eliminated. Specific influences can be traced through the entire history of Western education. From the medieval universities that adapted Greek ideas about personal relationships between teachers and students to modern graduate programs, where advisor-student relationships still echo the intense personal bonds that characterized ancient Greek mentorship. The concept that learning involves more than just transferring information, that it requires personal connection, emotional engagement, and long-term relationship, traces directly back to the gymnasium and symposium culture of classical Athens. How later generations viewed Greek relationship culture reveals fascinating patterns of selective memory and cultural adaptation that would make modern public relations specialists weep with admiration. Medieval Christian scholars managed to preserve and celebrate Greek intellectual achievements while completely ignoring or condemning the romantic and sexual aspects of the relationships that had produced those achievements. Renaissance humanists embraced Greek educational ideals while carefully repackaging them in forms that were compatible with contemporary moral standards and social expectations. The myths versus realities that developed around Greek culture created a sanitized version of history that emphasized philosophical dialogue and intellectual development, while editing out the gymnasium nudity, symposium drinking games, and romantic relationships that had been integral parts of the original system. It's like creating a documentary about rock and roll that focuses exclusively on the musical theory while never mentioning the drug, sex, and rebellious attitude that were central to the actual culture. Why Greek relationship culture remained important or forgotten in different contexts depended largely on how well its core insights could be adapted to changing social and moral frameworks. The educational aspects, the idea that learning requires personal connection and emotional engagement, proved to be universally valuable and were preserved in various forms across different cultures and time periods. The romantic and political aspects were more culturally specific and were either abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. The persistence of Greek influence in unexpected areas includes everything from modern coaching and mentorship programs to therapeutic relationships and leadership development. The basic insight that personal growth requires intimate connection with experienced guides has been rediscovered and repackaged countless times, usually without any awareness of its origins in ancient Greek culture. Perhaps most significantly, the Greek model established the fundamental Western assumption that education should be about personal development and individual fulfillment, rather than just job training or cultural indoctrination. This idea that learning should transform the person, not just fill their head with information, was so revolutionary that it's still controversial in many educational systems today. That the long-term historical impact also includes the development of concepts about friendship, mentorship, and personal development that influenced everything from Christian monasticism to modern psychotherapy. The Greek insight that human beings develop through intimate relationships with others who care about their growth became one of the foundational assumptions of Western culture, even when the specific forms those relationships took change dramatically. The most ironic aspect of this legacy is how thoroughly the original context has been forgotten while the core insights continue to influence modern life. We live in a culture that celebrates mentorship, values personal development, and assumes that learning should involve emotional engagement and personal transformation. But most people have no idea that these ideas originated in a social system. That would make modern HR departments file immediate complaints with their legal departments. Today, we can see echoes of ancient Greek relationship culture in contexts so common that we rarely notice them. Like discovering that the background music in every coffee shop follows patterns established by medieval monks. It's everywhere once you start looking for it, but invisible until someone points it out. The specific parallels are often startling in their similarity to patterns that were established over 2,000 years ago in the gymnasiums and symposiums of classical Athens. Graduate school advisor relationships represent perhaps the most direct modern descendant of Greek mentorship culture, complete with the same mixture of intellectual development, personal attachment, and potential for both inspiring growth and catastrophic abuse of power. The modern PhD advisor who guides a student through years of research, provides emotional support during difficult periods, opens doors to professional opportunities, and maintains a relationship that often lasts for decades. This is essentially the ancient Greek mentor-student relationship, with the romantic component officially removed and the intellectual component formalized through institutional structures. The specific parallels include the age and status differences between advisors and students, the combination of intellectual guidance with personal development, the expectation that the relationship will evolve over time from dependence to collaboration to eventual equality, and the way these relationships create professional networks that influence entire careers. The problems are also similar: power imbalances, boundary violations, favoritism, and the difficulty of separating personal and professional elements in relationships that involve such intimate intellectual and emotional connection. Coaching and mentorship programs in business and sports contexts reveal another set of modern parallels that show how the Greek model has been adapted to contemporary needs. Executive coaching, leadership development programs, and athletic training relationships all echo the Greek insight that personal excellence requires intimate guidance from experienced practitioners who care about the individual's development. The modern executive coach who helps a business leader develop better decision-making skills and emotional intelligence is essentially performing the same function as a Greek mentor, just with different content and contemporary vocabulary. Modern networking culture, particularly in industries like entertainment, technology, and academia, operates on principles that would be immediately recognizable to ancient Greeks who navigated symposium politics. The informal relationships that determine who gets opportunities, who gets invited to important gatherings, who gets access to influential people. These networks still function through personal connections that combine professional advancement with social interaction and often include elements of personal attraction and emotional attachment. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes apparent when you look at how modern people still crave the kind of meaningful relationships that were central to Greek culture. Despite all our technological advances and institutional sophistication, people still want mentors who care about them personally, still form professional relationships that include emotional attachment, still seek communities where intellectual and social development happen together rather than in separate spheres. Similar patterns in different contexts appear everywhere, from religious communities to artistic scenes to political movements. The master-apprentice relationships in traditional crafts, the teacher-student bonds in martial arts, the mentor-protege relationships in creative fields, all of these echo Greek patterns while adapting to different cultural contexts and social requirements. The most striking modern parallel might be found in online communities and social media relationships, where people form intense personal connections around shared interests, where intellectual and emotional intimacy develop simultaneously, and where the boundaries between public and private, personal and professional, become blurred in ways that would be familiar to anyone who had navigated ancient Greek symposium culture. Lessons for contemporary issues include both positive and negative examples of how to manage relationships that combine personal and professional elements. The Greek experience shows both the tremendous potential for growth and achievement that can emerge from intimate mentorship relationships, and the serious risks of abuse, favoritism, and boundary violations that such relationships create. Modern dating and relationship culture also shows interesting parallels, particularly in how people navigate the tension between emotional authenticity and social expectations, how they balance individual desires with community standards, and how they manage relationships that serve multiple functions: romantic, intellectual, social, professional, simultaneously. The complexity that made ancient Greek relationships so productive and so problematic hasn't disappeared. It's just been distributed across different types of relationships and institutional contexts. Even now, ancient Greek relationship culture influences areas of modern life in ways that most people never recognize, like discovering that your favorite restaurant's layout was designed according to principles established by medieval architects. The influence is real and significant, but hidden beneath layers of adaptation and cultural change that make the connections invisible to casual observation. Academic study of Greek culture continues to shape how we understand education, personal development, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and social responsibility. Modern research in psychology, education, and organizational behavior regularly rediscovers insights about mentorship, learning, and human development that were first articulated in Greek contexts, usually without any awareness of the historical precedents. Popular culture representations of mentorship, friendship, and personal growth draw heavily on Greek models. From superhero stories about older heroes training younger protégés to business books about leadership development that echo ancient Greek ideas about the relationship between personal excellence and social contribution. The archetypal mentor figure, wise, caring, demanding, personally invested in the student's development, is essentially the Greek mentor stripped of historical context and cultural specificity. Political discourse about education policy, mentorship programs, and youth development often returns to fundamentally Greek assumptions about how people learn and grow, even when the speakers have no knowledge of ancient Greek culture. The ongoing debates about personalized versus standardized education, about the role of emotional relationships in learning, about how to balance individual development with social needs. These are all variations on themes that were first explored in Greek symposiums and gymnasiums. Why people still care about Greek approaches to relationships reflects the enduring appeal of their core insight. that human beings develop best through intimate connections with others who care about their growth and who can provide both intellectual guidance and emotional support. This insight transcends cultural and historical boundaries because it addresses fundamental aspects of human psychology and social development that remain constant across different societies and time periods. The most fascinating aspect of Greek relationship culture's modern legacy is how naturally it evolved into forms that serve similar functions while adapting to completely different social and moral frameworks. Like watching a river change course over centuries while maintaining its essential character as a waterway, Greek mentorship principles have flowed through different cultural landscapes while preserving their core insights about human development and personal growth. Modern therapeutic relationships represent one of the most direct evolutionary descendants of Greek mentorship culture, combining the same elements of personal attention, emotional intimacy, and long-term commitment to individual development that characterized ancient mentor-student relationships. The professional boundaries and ethical frameworks that govern modern therapy serve the same function as the social protocols that regulated Greek mentorship. May provide structure and protection while allowing for the kind of intimate connection that makes personal transformation possible. Educational innovations in fields like progressive schooling, experiential learning, and personalized instruction all echo Greek insights about the importance of combining intellectual and emotional development, even when the educators involved have no knowledge of classical precedents. The modern understanding that effective teaching requires personal connection, that learning involves the whole person rather than just the intellect, that educational relationships should be transformative rather than merely informational. These ideas represent the natural evolution of principles that were first developed in ancient Greek contexts. The persistence of these patterns across such different cultural contexts suggests that Greek relationship culture identified something fundamental about how human beings learn, grow, and develop their potential. The specific forms have changed dramatically. We don't have naked wrestling in educational institutions anymore, thank goodness, but the underlying insights about the relationship between personal connection and intellectual development continue to influence how we approach education, mentorship, and personal growth in contexts that would astonish and probably horrify the ancient Greeks who first developed these ideas. Looking back across the centuries we've traveled together tonight, from the marble columns of ancient gymnasiums to the gymnasiums to the coffee shops where modern graduate students still form intense relationships with their advisors, we've seen a story that's both completely foreign to our modern sensibilities and surprisingly familiar in its fundamental insights about how human beings learn, grow, and connect with each other. The major themes that have emerged from this exploration read like a guidebook for understanding not just ancient Greek culture, but the persistent challenges that every society faces when trying to balance individual fulfillment with social responsibility, personal relationships with institutional efficiency, and the messy reality of human nature with the idealistic goals of educational and political systems. The key patterns we've discovered reveal how revolutionary the Greek approach actually was, and why it continues to influence us even when we don't realize it. They created a system where education was inseparable from personal relationships, where intellectual development required emotional engagement, where civic responsibility emerged from intimate bonds between individuals rather than abstract commitment to institutions. This integration of different aspects of human experience, physical, intellectual, emotional, social, political, was so comprehensive that it took centuries for later civilizations to figure out how to preserve its benefits while avoiding its complications. The most surprising discoveries along our journey have been the contradictions that made Greek relationship culture both brilliant and problematic, innovative and destructive, inspiring and deeply troubling. The same mentor-student relationships that produced Plato's philosophy also created the networks that enabled political conspiracies. The same symposium culture that fostered intellectual dialogue also provided cover for activities that undermined civic institutions. The same personal bonds that were supposed to create loyalty and virtue also became weapons for political manipulation and personal betrayal. Most important takeaways include the recognition that Greeks, were grappling with fundamental questions about human development and social organization that we're still trying to answer today. How do you create meaningful relationships in institutional settings? How you balance individual needs with community responsibilities? How you maintain cultural creativity while ensuring fair access to opportunities? How do you handle the power dynamics that inevitably emerge when older, more experienced people guide younger, less experienced ones? How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reveals the complexity of trying to judge historical cultures by modern standards while also learning from their experiences. The Greeks weren't simply more enlightened or more repressed than we are. They were people dealing with universal human challenges using the cultural tools and social institutions available to them. Their solutions were both innovative and limited, both inspiring and problematic, both successful and ultimately unsustainable. The evolution of our understanding also shows how historical analysis requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. We can appreciate the intellectual and cultural achievements that emerged from Greek relationship culture while also recognizing the exclusions and abuses that were built into the system. We can learn from their insights about education and personal development while also understanding why their specific approaches became incompatible with later social and moral frameworks. Perhaps most importantly, this journey has revealed how the personal and political, the individual and social, the romantic and intellectual are always interconnected in ways that institutional solutions can manage but never completely resolve. The Greeks created a system that acknowledged these connections explicitly, with both the benefits and the complications that such acknowledgement brings. As we near the end of our exploration, there's one final story that encapsulates the broader themes we've been exploring. A tale that reveals both the beauty and the tragedy of a civilization that dared to build its entire educational and political system on the foundation of intimate personal relationships. Is the story of the last symposium, an event that probably never happened as a single historical moment, but represents the collective end of a cultural tradition that had shaped Western civilization for centuries. Imagine, if you will, a gathering in late antiquity, perhaps in Athens in the 4th or 5th century CE, when the old gymnasium culture was dying and Christian institutions were beginning to dominate education and social life. The participants would have been the last generation to remember the traditional ways. Elderly men who had experienced the classical mentor-student relationships in their youth and who were now watching those traditions disappear into institutional structures and religious frameworks that had no place for the intimate bonds that had once been considered essential to education and civic life. The setting would have been modest compared to the elaborate symposiums of classical Athens, perhaps a simple dinner party in a private home, with couches arranged in the traditional manner, but without the elaborate protocols and cultural confidence that had characterized earlier gatherings. The participants would have been acutely aware that they were participating in something that was ending, that the younger generation was being educated in schools run by Christian monks or Roman administrators who viewed the traditional Greek approach to relationships as morally suspect at best. The conversation at this imaginary final symposium would have been both nostalgic and analytical, as the participants tried to understand what was being lost and what was being preserved in the transformation of their culture. They would have discussed the benefits and problems of the old system with the kind of reflective wisdom that comes from watching historical change happen in your own lifetime. They would have debated whether the new approaches to education and social organization were improvements or losses, whether the institutional solutions that were replacing personal relationships were more fair and efficient or simply more impersonal and less inspiring. What this story reveals about the human dimension of historical change is how the end of cultural traditions is experienced by the people who live through them. The transformation of Greek society wasn't just an abstract historical process. It was something that affected real individuals who had built their identities, relationships, and understanding of the world around institutions and practices that were disappearing before their eyes. The participants in our imaginary final symposium would have been people who had experienced both the benefits and the problems of the traditional system. They would have known the joy of intimate intellectual relationships and the pain of romantic betrayals, the excitement of philosophical discovery and the disappointment of political corruption, the satisfaction of mentoring younger people and the frustration of watching those mentorships become misunderstood or regulated out of existence. How it connects to everything we've discussed becomes clear when we realize that this imaginary gathering represents the eternal human struggle to balance competing values and needs that can never be perfectly reconciled. The desire for meaningful relationships and the need for institutional fairness, the value of personal excellence and the importance of social equality, the appeal of intimate communities and the requirements of large-scale organization. These tensions that the Greeks grappled with are the same ones we face today, just in different forms and with different cultural tools. The memorable final image that emerges from this story is of people who understood both what they were losing and what they were gaining, who could appreciate the genuine improvements that new institutions provided while also mourning the loss of approaches to human development and social connection that had produced remarkable achievements and meaningful relationships for generations of Greeks who came before them. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the complicated, fascinating, and surprisingly relevant world of ancient Greek relationships, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate what we've discovered together about the persistence of human nature across time and cultural change. The Greeks faced the same fundamental challenges we do: how to create meaningful connections, how to balance individual desires with social responsibilities, how to build institutions that serve human needs without crushing human creativity, how to manage the inevitable tensions between personal relationships and public obligations. Their solutions were both inspiring and flawed, both innovative and limited by the assumptions and prejudices of their time. They created approaches to education and personal development that were so insightful that we're still trying to figure out how to implement their best ideas, and so problematic that we're still trying to avoid their worst mistakes. The gymnasium and symposium cultures that produced Socratic philosophy and Platonic ideals also created systems of exclusion and abuse that remind us how difficult it is to build institutions that bring out the best in human nature without also enabling the worst. The gentle conclusion to our exploration is that understanding Greek relationship culture helps us understand ourselves, not because we should try to recreate their specific practices, but because their experiences illuminate the persistent challenges and opportunities that every civilization faces when trying to create systems that support human flourishing. Their successes and failures provide insights that are relevant to anyone trying to navigate the complexities of modern relationships, whether in educational, professional, or personal contexts. The appreciation for this journey lies not just in learning about an interesting historical topic, but in gaining perspective on the assumptions and practices that shape our own lives. The Greeks remind us that our current approaches to education, mentorship, and social organization aren't the only possible ways of doing things, and that alternative models, even flawed ones, can provide valuable insights into possibilities we might not have considered. The invitation to reflection that emerges from this exploration is to consider how the insights and mistakes of Greek relationship culture might inform our own choices about how to create meaningful connections, how to support each other's growth and development, and how to build communities that honor both individual needs and collective responsibilities. The peaceful closing thought is that across all the centuries and cultural changes we've explored tonight, the fundamental human desire for connection, growth, and meaning remains constant. The Greeks found ways to pursue these goals that were both remarkably sophisticated and deeply flawed. Our challenge is to learn from their experience while creating approaches that serve our own time and circumstances. And so we come to the end of our time together tonight, having traveled from the marble gymnasiums of classical Athens to the institutional frameworks of our modern world, following the thread of human relationships through centuries of cultural change and social transformation. We've seen how the Greeks created something remarkable and problematic, beautiful and tragic, inspiring and troubling, a civilization that dared to make intimate personal relationships the foundation of education, politics, and cultural achievement. The story we've explored together reveals both the possibilities and the limitations of trying to build social institutions around the complex reality of human nature rather than trying to manage or suppress that complexity through bureaucratic structures and institutional rules. The Greeks showed us what can happen when education acknowledges that learning involves the whole person, when politics recognizes that governance requires personal trust and loyalty, when culture emerges from intimate communities of people who care deeply about each other's development and achievement. But they also showed us the dangers and injustices that can emerge when personal relationships become the primary determinant of access to opportunities, when romantic attachments influence political decisions, when intimate networks exclude those who don't fit the dominant social patterns. Their experience reminds us that there are no perfect solutions to the fundamental challenges of human social organization, only different trade-offs and different ways of managing the inevitable tensions between competing values and needs. As you settle back into your evening, perhaps reflecting on the relationships that have shaped your own life, the teachers who influenced your thinking, the mentors who opened doors for you, the friendships that have sustained you through difficult times, remember that you're participating in patterns of human connection that have roots stretching back to those ancient gymnasiums and symposiums where young Greeks first learned that education is about more than information transfer, that development requires community, and that the most important learning happens through relationships that engage both mind and heart. The soft background hum of your fan and the gentle darkness of your room create a peaceful space for contemplating these ancient insights and their modern relevance. The Greeks are long gone, but their questions remain with us. How do we create meaningful connections in institutional settings? How do we balance individual fulfillment with social responsibility? How do we build communities that support both excellence and equality? These are our questions now, and tonight's journey has shown us one civilization's remarkable attempt to answer them. Rest well, and thank you for joining me on this exploration of love, learning, and the persistence of human nature across the centuries.